Okay, how to complete the square and put something into vertex form. Okay, so for parabola. Okay, so you can take your time and go through these notes, but I'll just, briefly do the highlights. So the process is called completing the square, and what we're going to do is we're going to go from general form or standard form and switch it so that it looks like vertex form. So you are going to first put all the variables that are alike next to each other, so all the x's together, all the y's together. We're moving any variables or constants that are not involved in the completing the square to the other side, and what that means is if the x is squared, I want all the x's on one side and the y's on the other side. If the y's are squared, I want the y's on one side and all the x's on the other. If they're both squared, then I need all of them to be on the same side, and that's going to happen in a future lesson, but for this one, we're just going to put variables on opposite sides. If the coefficient on the squared term is not a 1, you have to take that out first to make sure that you complete the square properly. You can never complete the square when the leading coefficient is more than a 1. You have to substitute, or not substitute it out, but take out the GCF to get rid of that. Then we're going to actually complete the square, and I like to call it completing the box because you'll see I will actually make a box while I'm doing it. And to do that process, that's explained here in step 5 and 6. So those are your steps, they're written, but I'm going to go actually do an example because it makes more sense to see the numbers with it. But feel free to refer to this one, have it up on your iPad or whatever, but again, make sure you're taking your notes on loose leaf paper so that you get the credit for doing this homework assignment, which is taking the notes. All right. So here's the one we're going to do. So since the y is what's squared, we are going to move anything that's not a y to the other side. So the 4x and the 13, we're going to move them off to the other side of the equation. So I'm going to do that by subtracting the 4x and subtracting the 13 to the other side. They cancel on this side, so I now have y squared plus 6y equals negative 4x minus 13. Okay, so then the process says make sure you have a leading coefficient of a 1, which I do, and as long as that is true, we can add a box to this side. Now, if I add a box to the left side, I have to make sure I add a box to the right side, because whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So the process of completing the square is we are trying to get it into this format right here, so that right this second it's going to look like this is going to be A is here, and then my X is going to end up being in this spot, and there'll be an H. So the formula, I should not have written it in that place. Let me erase that real quick. Ultimately, we are going to end up with it being X equals A, Y minus K squared plus H. So that's not an H, Mrs. Smith, you did it again. That's what we're trying to get it into. So we're trying to change it from this form to this form that I've circled. So I need this piece right here to become a perfect square binomial. Oh, perfect square binomial. That's why it's called complete the square, even though I didn't draw a very good square. So since this is a 1, I go to the middle term, which is a 6. I divide by 2. Every time I take the middle term and divide by 2. Every time. Doesn't matter when you're doing the completing the square, you're always dividing by 2. After you divide by 2, you square that number. So I divide by 2 and square. That is the number that goes in the box. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. So I put a 9 in both boxes. Because remember, if I add 9 to the left side, I have to add 9 to the right side. What we're going to do now is clean it up. So on the right-hand side, I get negative 4x minus 4. On the left-hand side, what I just did is turn this into a perfect square trinomial, which means when I factor it, it is a square binomial. So I need my parentheses and a square, and I know it's going to have a y, and the question is, what number, when I multiply it, gives me 9, and when I add it, gives me a 6, and that's a positive 3. So now the last thing I have to do, remember we're trying to get it in this form, so we are going to pull the negative 4 out. We get x plus 1. And then I'm going to divide by that negative 4 because I need to have an a term, so I need to know what that is going to be. So I now have negative 1/4 y plus 3 squared equals x plus 1. And the last thing I'm going to do to get it in that form is to subtract this 1 to the other side. So x equals a negative 1/4 y plus 3 squared minus 1. And that is putting it into vertex form. Of course, it also asks me some other stuff, but at least look at this for a few seconds and make sure you understand what's going on. Okay, so the problem actually asks us to find the vertex, the focus, the directrix, and then graph. But I have to be able to put it into vertex form so that I can actually find these pieces of information. So from vertex form, I know that inside the parentheses, there is, inside parentheses, is the variable y. So I know the y part of my vertex is going to be a negative 3. So I know this is a negative 3. I also know my axis of symmetry then is going to be y equals negative 3 because it's the variable that's inside the parentheses here. So the y and the negative 3. Now I know the x part is the number that's out front, exactly what it says. So negative 1, negative 3 is my vertex. To find the focus and the directrix, remember we learned this the previous day, I have to do this math up here to figure out what p is. So I know that 1 over 4p is equal to the a value, and our a value in this case is negative 1/4. So that equals 1 over 4p. And when we cross multiply, we find out that p equals negative 1, but it's supposed to be absolute value, so that's why it's a positive 1. Now that's our distance from the vertex to the focus and to the directrix. And the last thing we're going to do just before we do our graph is we need to know this value over here, which is the width, and that's 1 divided by our a, and our a is a fraction, negative 1/4, absolute value. And when I divide by that fraction, we find out, of course, that that equals 4. So to do our graph, we're going to first graph our vertex, which is at 1, negative 3. And then we're going to actually draw our axis of symmetry. And since the x is alone, we know that this is going to be opening left or right. Our a value is negative, so that means it opens to the left. So our axis of symmetry should be going horizontally at y equals negative 3, which we already wrote down. And now what we're going to do is graph our focus, which is 1 unit away in the direction open. So there's our focus. 1 unit behind is our directrix. And we're just going to record those now because they did ask me for them. So this red vertical line is at x, it's the y-axis, so it's x equals 0. And the focus is at negative 2, negative 3. And then to graph, remember what happens is this is the width, total width, from the focus. So since it's 4, that means I go up 2 and down 2 and connect those dots. And there's our parabola. And now you can practice your homework problems by following these steps. Good luck!